So, something strange happened to me while I was in Isle Royale, Michigan. It's mostly wild land, not the kind of place tourists usually go. But I didn't mind because I'm a biologist, or at least that's what the university I was with said I was. I was there to study wolves. It might sound a little dangerous, but it's better than sitting behind a desk. Wolves have always fascinated me. They're both loners and part of a pack, scary but respected. They show up in a lot of stories, often representing the wild, untamed side of nature. To me, their lives show how nature stays in balance. I admire that and have spent my life trying to understand and protect it. That's why I was excited to work in Isle Royale, just me and the wilderness. It felt like a kid's adventure. I packed my tracking gear, an old notebook, and set out one morning, feeling both nervous and excited. By sunset, when the sky was pink and orange, I could hear wolves howling in the distance. I liked being out there in the middle of nowhere, feeling connected to nature. But I didn't realize I was about to experience something that would shake me up. As I explored, I started noticing wolf tracks, their droppings, and their usual behaviors. One day, I was picking wild blueberries and checking how many were ripe when something strange happened. You know that cold feeling you get when you walk into an air-conditioned room on a hot day. Well, imagine feeling that suddenly in the middle of the wilderness with no AC in sight. That's what happened to me. It got really cold, like out of nowhere. Goosebumps covered my skin, and I started shivering. It was like the sun had just disappeared, leaving me in freezing cold. I thought maybe it was just a weather thing. Strange, sure, but not impossible. But then I noticed something else, a huge shadow moving near me. The shadow was always there, but it would disappear whenever I tried to look directly at it. And the worst part? This terrible smell came with it. It was like the smell of something dead and rotting, way worse than anything I'd ever smelled before, even as a wolf tracker used to dealing with death. This was different, though. It was creepy, and honestly, I was scared. I started thinking, what could be bigger than a moose and smell this bad on this isolated island? I was frightened, but I thought I should face whatever it was. I expected to see a bear or a large moose when I turned around. That would have made sense. But when I looked back and saw nothing, it scared me even more. It was so quiet. No rustling leaves, no animals making noises. Just complete silence. That horrible smell stayed in the air, and for a moment I felt unsure. But I reminded myself, I'm a scientist. A biologist is supposed to stay calm and observe, even if the temperature drops and there's a bad smell. Maybe it was just a dead animal or something else. But I didn't realize I wasn't just dealing with the usual wilderness. Isle Royale had mysteries, and local legends too. Part of me was telling me to leave. The cold and creepy atmosphere around me scared me so much that I decided to pack up and go. The sun was already setting, so I figured it was time to call it a day. Later that night, sitting by my campfire with my food, everything seemed normal again. It was so strange. I knew something was off. The wild had shown me something different, something I couldn't write down or study under a microscope. I kept thinking about what happened, wondering if the old Wendigo stories might be true. What I experienced matched the descriptions: a bad smell, sudden cold, and the feeling of being watched. Could it have been a real Wendigo? Thinking back, I might never know what happened that day on Isle Royale. I don't have any hard facts, but remembering it still freaks me out. It's a reminder that no matter how much we think we know about the world, there are always things we don't understand. I study creatures that live in caves, and about 3 years ago, I was working on some night research in a big cave in Kentucky. It might seem odd, but this cave is home to many different animals, and scientists like it because it's huge and full of interesting wildlife. I love what I do. The animals, especially bats, are fascinating. They're like tiny flying relics of the past. Plus, the peace and quiet inside the cave at night is unbeatable. The cave is spooky but peaceful. It gives you chills, but it's calming at the same time. It was winter, and I was counting bats as part of my research. The night started like any other. It was freezing, and as I entered the cave with my flashlight, the air inside felt damp and cold, very different from the dry cold outside. The cave rocks were sharp and icy, making it hard to walk around. Every step I took felt like a sound I had heard before, like the cave was echoing my movements. It was lonely, but in a nice way. My job wasn't too exciting. I mostly just counted bats sleeping for the winter. I would sometimes check a bat or two to make sure they were healthy. After I finished counting a group, I started packing up, and that's when I heard a strange noise. It wasn't a sound I usually hear from the animals in the cave. I know the noises bats make, but this was something different. It gave me an eerie feeling. At first, I thought maybe someone else was in the cave, but that seemed unlikely because this cave is pretty remote. The clicking noise had a strange rhythm to it, like it was intentional, almost like something was watching me. The deeper I went into the cave, the more uncomfortable I felt. The sound of water dripping from the ceiling was constant, like a slow drum beat. Then the clicking noise interrupted again, out of place, like a wrong note in a song. I walked deeper until I reached a huge open area where I couldn't see the walls or ceiling. Thousands of bats hung above me in the darkness. It was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the sound of water dropping into an unseen pool. I shone my flashlight around, looking for the source of the noise. A bat suddenly flew by, startling me. As I calmed down, I noticed a strange shadow in the distance. It didn't look like the rocks or the usual cave formations. The shadow moved. It crawled quickly, faster than any normal animal. I realized something wasn't right. This wasn't the usual wildlife I studied. Something was seriously wrong. The clicking noises returned, louder and closer this time. The shadow looked like a person, but twisted and unnatural. It was about as tall as a person, but it moved like it belonged in the cave. Its skin was pale and thin, like it had never seen sunlight. It had huge black eyes that locked onto me. The creature had no nose and a wide-open mouth. It was all wrong, like something from a nightmare. The clicking noise came again, echoing off the cave walls. I was frozen with fear, unsure what to do. I knew I had to leave. I hurriedly packed my gear, all while keeping an eye on the creature. The cave fell silent as I made my way back toward the entrance. When I finally looked back, the creature had disappeared into the darkness and the clicking noise stopped. Sitting in my Jeep afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something beyond explanation. Was it a person who had been lost in the cave for too long? Or was it something else entirely? Nothing made sense. Since that night, the cave hasn't felt the same to me. It's still just as dark and quiet, but now I feel like something is always watching. I've spent years studying the strange things that live in caves, but this experience made me question everything. Sometimes science can't explain what we see, and that thought haunts me. I wish I had answers for what happened on our farm, but I don't. Nobody does. Sometimes things stay a mystery, and that's the scariest part, the not knowing. Our family had lived on this farm for generations. It had always been our way of life, passed down from my grandparents to my parents, and finally to me. Life on the farm was simple, but it was hard work. We got up early, sometimes as early as 4 in the morning, never later than 6. There was always something to be done, whether it was feeding the animals or tending to the crops. By nightfall, we'd be so exhausted from the day that sleep came easily. I always liked living on the farm. My siblings didn't, so when the time came, I was the one who stayed behind, inheriting the old farmhouse. I was the youngest, so before I knew it, my parents passed, and the farm became mine, the house, the land, and all the animals. At that time, I wasn't married, and a few of my friends came to live with me. They grew up nearby, and we had gone to school together. None of them were married either, and we didn't have any big responsibilities. It seemed like a good idea to share the farm. We had the freedom to live a quiet, peaceful life, and for a while, we did. We had all kinds of animals, horses named Valentina and Katie, chickens, goats, pigs, and plenty of cows. Life was predictable in a way. Every now and then, predators would come after our livestock. It wasn't unusual. Once we had a bear that kept sneaking into the pig pen down by the foothills. We had to put it down when we finally caught it, and we even found one of our pigs inside its stomach. As hard as it was, we knew that's how life was sometimes. Nature was tough, and we had to protect what was ours. But then, something started happening that we couldn't explain. The first time it happened, it was in the chicken coop. We were still up, unwinding after a long day, when we heard the chickens squawking like something was attacking them. We thought maybe it was the bear again since we hadn't caught it at that point. We rushed outside to the coop, but by the time we got there, whatever had caused the commotion was gone. What we found was a mess, feathers everywhere and dead chickens scattered around the coop. It was odd, though. Usually, when a predator attacks, they take the body with them to eat, but this time, the chickens were just lying there. What was even stranger was that the chickens didn't seem to have any visible wounds. No claw marks, no bites, just dead chickens. We couldn't make sense of it. We thought maybe they had died from some sort of disease, but that wouldn't explain the mess of feathers or the sounds we heard. Still, it seemed like the most logical answer, so I called my friend, who was an animal doctor, to come and take a look. She showed up the next afternoon and was just as puzzled as we were. After examining the chickens, she found something we hadn't noticed before: 2 small puncture wounds hidden under the feathers. And the most unsettling part? The chickens had been drained of blood. Whatever had killed them wasn't a normal predator. The doctor couldn't tell us what it was, but it was clear that something strange was happening. We decided to keep watch over the coop for the next few nights, taking turns staying up to see if we could catch whatever was responsible. But nothing happened, and after a while, we figured it was over. Life went back to normal. Several months later, when the weather started warming up, one of our cows collapsed in the middle of the day. We thought it might have been dehydration or maybe an illness, but we didn't even consider the chicken incident at the time. Once again, my friend came out to check on the cow, and that's when we discovered it had an unusually low blood count, just like the chickens. And there, hidden in the cow's hide, were the same 2 puncture wounds. Over the next few weeks, more animals started showing similar signs. We lost several cows, and a few of the goats fell ill. In some cases, we found square patches of skin missing from their bodies. I'm not sure if the same thing that killed the chickens was responsible for that, but it seemed too coincidental not to be connected. It was taking a toll on all of us, mentally and emotionally. We couldn't understand what was happening, and more importantly, we didn't know how to stop it. We tried keeping a closer eye on the animals, staying up late and watching for anything unusual. A couple of times we thought we spotted something moving around in the darkness, but it always turned out to be something normal, like a coyote or a stray dog. Whatever was killing our animals seemed smarter than we gave it credit for. It was almost like it knew we were watching and made sure to stay hidden. More animals died, and we were at a loss. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the attacks stopped. For months, everything was quiet. We never figured out what was behind it all. None of us had ever seen anything like it, and my parents and grandparents had never spoken of anything like this happening before. To this day, I don't know what was out there or why it targeted our farm. Maybe it was some unknown creature, or maybe it was something we'll never understand. All I know is that it was real, and it left its mark on our farm. The scariest part is that I still don't have the answers, and maybe I never will. I used to think legends were just made-up stories, things people told to pass the time or scare kids around a campfire. But one evening, something happened to me that changed everything. I'm usually the kind of person who laughs off stories about monsters or strange creatures. But now, I have a story to tell, and I promise, it's all true. I was out in a quiet forest near a small town. People said strange things happened there, but I wasn't interested in that. I'm a nature photographer, and I was just there to take pictures of animals. That night, the moon was full and bright, lighting up the trees in a silver glow. The shadows stretched long, and the forest felt peaceful, almost magical. The cool night air was crisp, and I could hear the usual sounds of the woods, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional hoot of an owl. I set up my camera near a clearing, hoping to get some good shots of animals under the moonlight. Everything seemed normal at first, but soon, things took a strange turn. The forest suddenly went quiet. If you've ever spent time in nature, you know that when everything goes silent, it usually means something is wrong. It's like all the animals know a predator is nearby and are holding their breath. I felt uneasy, but I brushed it off and looked through my camera lens. As I scanned the surroundings, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was just a large dog walking through the trees. But when it stepped into the light, I realized it wasn't a dog at all. It was standing on two legs. Its ears were pointed, and its face looked more like a wolf's than a dog's, with a long snout and sharp features. I stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. The creature sniffed the air, and its glowing eyes scanned the clearing like it was looking for something. Then, to my horror, it looked right at me. I was terrified. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, unable to do anything but watch. The creature didn't seem to notice me at first, but as it started to move, it became clear that it knew I was there. It began walking slowly around the clearing, circling me like a predator stalking its prey. I tried to follow it with my camera, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the lens steady. The shutter clicked quietly, and I managed to take a few photos, but I couldn't stop trembling. As the creature moved, something incredible happened. It spoke. The sound wasn't like a growl or howl, but actual words. They were rough and garbled, like it was struggling to form them, but it was clear the creature was trying to talk. I couldn't understand what it was saying, and honestly, I didn't want to. All I wanted was for the nightmare to end. The creature stepped closer, moving with an eerie grace. It was massive and powerful, but it didn't seem in a hurry. Its fur was matted in places, like it had lived wild for a long time. But its eyes, that's what scared me the most. They were intelligent, not like the eyes of an ordinary animal. They glowed a strange amber color, a shade I had never seen before. The creature tilted its head and made a low sound, halfway between a grunt and a word. I was too scared to think, but somehow my survival instinct kicked in. I remembered my camera and lifted it, hoping to capture more evidence of what I was seeing. I pressed the shutter button again, the sound loud in the stillness of the forest. When the creature heard the camera, it paused. It didn't attack or growl. Instead, it stood up straighter, almost like it was annoyed by what I had done. For a moment, it seemed to be studying me, and I got the strange feeling that we were somehow communicating, though I didn't understand how. I took a small step back, my heart pounding in my chest. To my surprise, the creature did the same. It stepped back too, as if mimicking me. Was it trying to tell me something? I didn't know what to make of it. My mind was spinning. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and walked away. Its movements were silent, almost ghost-like. It glanced back once, and I could swear it gave me a final look of acknowledgement before disappearing into the trees. As soon as it was gone, the forest seemed to come back to life. The crickets started chirping again, and the breeze rustled the leaves. But I felt like I had just stepped out of a dream, or maybe a nightmare. My hands were shaking, and my legs felt weak, but I managed to pack up my camera gear and head back to my truck. I didn't stop driving until I was far from the forest. The photos I took were the only proof I had of what happened that night, but I wasn't sure if anyone would believe me. I barely believed it myself. All I knew was that the world didn't feel the same anymore. Since that night, I still go into the woods, camera in hand, but I'm more cautious now. I listen for the silence, that eerie quiet that comes before something strange appears. I don't know if I'll ever see the creature again, but one thing is for sure. Legends aren't just stories. Sometimes they're real. It had been many years since I last saw my old classmates. Life had taken me far away from the small town where I grew up, but when I received an invitation to my school reunion, I decided it was time to go back. I was curious to see how everyone had changed, to hear their stories, and to reconnect with people I hadn't thought about in years. The drive to the town felt strangely familiar. The roads hadn't changed much, though the town seemed smaller than I remembered. As I drove, memories from my school days started flooding back. Faces, places, events from what felt like another lifetime. The reunion was to be held in the community center, a place I had passed by 1,000 times as a kid, but never really paid attention to. About 5 miles outside of town, I saw someone standing on the side of the road, waving for me to stop. I slowed down and pulled over. As the figure approached, I recognized him almost immediately. It was Mike, one of my old classmates. We weren't particularly close back in the day, but we got along well enough, sharing a few classes and the occasional conversation. Mike looked almost the same as he had in high school, just a little older, like the rest of us. He had that same friendly smile I remembered. I felt a bit of comfort seeing a familiar face so soon after arriving, and I was glad to give him a ride. He climbed into the passenger seat, and we started catching up. The conversation was casual, mostly about what we had been doing since school. I talked about my job, my family, the places I had lived. Mike listened, smiling, occasionally adding small details about his life. He didn't say much about himself, though, and I found that a little odd. He asked if I could drop him off near the outskirts of town. I thought it was strange since I remembered him living closer to the center when we were kids, but I didn't question it. When we reached the outskirts, Mike told me to stop by the side of the road. He said he could walk the rest of the way. I offered to drive him closer, but he insisted, thanking me and stepping out of the car. I watched as he walked off into the distance, his figure fading into the twilight. Something about the whole encounter felt strange, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just nerves about the reunion. I arrived at the community center a little while later. The place was buzzing with excitement as old friends reunited, sharing stories, laughter, and memories. I recognized a few people right away and joined in the conversations, catching up on the years that had passed. As the evening went on, I couldn't help but mention that I had given Mike a ride into town. I expected smiles, maybe a few jokes about how he still managed to get someone else to drive him around, but instead, there was a sudden, uncomfortable silence. The group I was with stopped talking, their expressions shifting from friendly to confused, even concerned. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Everyone around me seemed uneasy, and for a moment, I didn't understand why. One of my classmates, looking pale, finally spoke up, and what they said left me feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. They told me that Mike had died many years ago. He had been in an accident, not long after we all graduated. It had been a terrible shock to everyone. They had all attended his funeral, a somber gathering that left a lasting impact on the class. Some of them still visited his grave from time to time, keeping his memory alive. But Mike had been gone for years, long before this reunion was even planned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It didn't make sense. I had just seen Mike, just spoken to him. He had been sitting in my car, listening to me talk about life. How could he be dead? Trying to piece together what had happened. Maybe it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, but the looks on my classmates' faces told me otherwise. There was no mistake. Mike was gone, and yet I had given him a ride just an hour before. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized what this meant. I had seen Mike, but not the living Mike I remembered from school.